Why does the U.S. need to onshore the production of advanced computer chips?
75% of the global economy depends in some way on the semiconductor supply chain. Semiconductors are this invisible, ubiquitous component of our daily lives. We've never been in a great power competition as a country where we don't have massive industrial firepower to kind of fall back on. We built a team with a culture that just was focused on the mission. People worked extraordinarily hard because we really felt it was important. It was important to the country.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Political Capital. Today we'll be talking with Michael Schmidt, former director of the U.S. CHIPS Office, about the semiconductor industry, how it developed historically, how federal policy is driving new investments, and what it all means for the U.S. with respect to China and other global competitors. My name is Nate Loewentheil. I'm the founder and managing partner of Commonweal Ventures and the host of Political Capital. Political Capital is a conversation series exploring the intersection of technology, policy, and finance. We're joined today by Michael Schmidt. Michael is most recently the director of the CHIPS Program Office at the U.S. Department of Commerce, which he helped establish and which was charged with implementing the 2022 CHIPS Act and investing somewhere north of $50 billion into the U.S. semiconductor industry. Prior to leading the CHIPS office, Michael has served as a senior advisor at the U.S. Treasury, as commissioner of the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance, and in a variety of other positions of public trust at the state and federal level. He holds a JD and a BA from Yale. Michael, let's start with CHIPS 101 here. Why are computer chips so essential to U.S. competitiveness and national security? Or maybe to put it more precisely, why does the U.S. need to onshore the production of advanced computer chips?
So it's kind of a funny thing. I mean, none of us, we don't see and feel computer chips in our day-to-day lives. You never say, hey, like, can you grab the semiconductor out of the fridge, right? Or like, hey, like, you tell your kid, like, hey, don't forget to take your semiconductor to school, right? But the fridge is filled with semiconductors, and the car on the way to school is filled with semiconductors, and the school itself has. So semiconductors are this invisible, ubiquitous component of our daily lives. Chris Miller wrote literally the book on semiconductors, and I would certainly recommend his book Chip Wars to all of your listeners. Chris says in that book that 75% of the global economy depends in some way on the semiconductor supply chain. You know, basically anything with an on-off switch is gonna depend on semiconductors. And by the way, that ranges from where a public conversation often takes the conversation of semiconductors, which is the most advanced chips that are critical for things like artificial intelligence and smartphones, as well as the most basic, day-to-day appliances, automobiles, oftentimes semiconductors that might cost 10 or 15 cents to buy. Absolutely foundational, and foundational not only for our day-to-day lives, but for our military. Basically any type of military equipment you can think of. What happened over the course of decades is an industry that the United States started out leading, inventing and leading in terms of the manufacturing. Over time, through the 70s, 80s, and then accelerating into the 90s and 2000s, offshored very substantially to East Asia. And we found ourselves as a country relying heavily on a few concentrated geographies, Taiwan most significantly, for this really critical component. And so the CHIPS Act, and happy to get into how that happened, why that happened. But the CHIPS Act at its core was a recognition that we have an economic and national security stake in creating more resilient semiconductor supply chain by onshoring the manufacturing and production of this essential technology. And by the way, it took the pandemic happening to kind of crystallize for the public why it was so important, because you had automobiles, car factories shutting down because they couldn't get some inexpensive chips. So that really kind of crystallized it. But there was a whole conversation leading up to that was really grounded in geopolitics and national security that created the kind of fertile ground for chips to pass in the wake of the pandemic.
I want to get back to that because I think that that's a really critical point. But just first, so we're all on the same page, it it's not that the U.S. doesn't produce any chips. We just don't produce the most advanced chips, right? I mean, we do produce some semiconductors. It's just not the ones powering the the cutting edge data centers on which AI depends.
Yeah, so we around 1990 we produced around 40% of global semiconductors, and now we're it got down to closer to 10%. And so the CHIPS Act at its core is about reversing that trend. So yes, we do produce some across the supply chain. We have high dependencies abroad, and at the most advanced chips, we went from kind of dominating globally to producing none,
Right.
zero
At the 3 nanometer, the 5 nanometer, the super advanced ones, we're zero.
at the
We
super
cannot
advanced.
produce them domestically.
Yes. Well, now we are, because I mean, we can, if we're fast forward, we have TSMC producing 4 nanometer chips in Arizona right now. But before that started happening at the beginning of 2025, it had been many years since we had produced leading edge chips on our shores.
And when you think about that sort of arc, so we invent them in 1947 or whatever, we're dominating the global industry, and then steadily but dramatically declines. Is that just part of the broader deindustrialization in the U.S., where we also were making most of the world's cars, and then we're making some of the world's cars, but not most of them? Or was there something special about this industry that made it such that the U.S. was lagging other countries?
I think it is a combination of factors, but a very familiar story and not unlike other industries, although maybe in some sense kind of more extreme than other industries. Part of it is just the natural forces of globalization and the drive for cheap, efficient labor and low cost production. Part of it is, places like Taiwan having very effective and concerted national strategies around building out the industry, but not just Taiwan, Japan, Korea, Singapore. And then part of it is a kind of amazing story of just a handful of companies, most notably TSMC,
Right.
that that kind of invents a business model and comes to truly dominate an industry because of how effectively they do their business.
And that business model innovation you're talking about was the decision, rather than feeling they had to both design and manufacture them, to be essentially an outsourced manufacturer for folks who are designing their own chips but just didn't want to actually make them.
That's right. That's right. So TSMC had the insight of separating design from manufacturing. And so alongside TSMC emerged what's called the fabless semiconductor industry. So a company like NVIDIA or AMD or Qualcomm, these companies that kind of drive the day-to-day news, they're a very capital light model. They do the design of chips, and then they outsource the manufacturing to TSMC.
And when you say
and
fab,
others,
I mean, they don't have the fabrication facilities.
that's right. Fab is a semiconductor factory is called a fab,
Right.
Fabrication facility. And so fabless means
Lacking in production facilities.
correct.
And Taiwan in particular was very much of a kind of a national strategy. I mean, TSMC was chartered by the state, or was very closely connected to the government. And not that they were trying to threaten the U.S. or anyone. It was just they saw an opportunity at a point where there was a burgeoning industry to really come and compete in it.
Yeah, I think they had a very reasonable and effective national strategy to say, here's a high value economic input that we want to have share in, and so they created ecosystems to really make it thrive. But once it started, I mean, that's the early story. But once it started, once TSMC started being successful, once other companies like UMC started being successful, I think it really became self-enforcing for Taiwan. And now, I've been to Taiwan and toured the fabs and seen the science parks, and you can just see it's all everything is right there in one place. You have the workforce and the training, manufacturers, you have their customers,
Specialized machinery, the whole
yes, the whole ecosystem is there. So part of what we were trying to do with the CHIPS Act, given the imperative on onshoring semiconductors here in the United States, is really develop that ecosystem.
Yeah.
Right. It's about as much as it was about actually producing the chips, it's about building the muscle as a country to be able to produce those chips.
Yeah.
And it makes a really big difference when you're making that incremental decision about where to make a capital investment as a semiconductor company, if there's a construction workforce that has experience building fabs, and if there's a university ecosystem that can produce technicians to run the factories, and if there's a network of material suppliers and equipment suppliers and servicers, all those things are kind of part of the ecosystem that make it easier to decide to invest here.
And I want to get back to that because it gets to the kind of design of the CHIPS Act and your implementation of it. But just before we get there, you started talking about, COVID was maybe the shock that pushed policymakers over the line to pass the CHIPS Act because it assumingly disrupted supply chains and made everyone realize, oh shoot, it's kind of a problem. But to me, it was kind of striking. It's like this trend was obvious. And I mean, anyone who knew anything about the industry could have told you for 20 years that, yeah, the US was falling behind. And, obviously people just didn't think it was that big a deal up until the late 2010s, right? I mean, it just was not a big part of the policy discussion. And so I'm sort of curious, like, what is it that shifted that made this, quite a big and rare bipartisan area of agreement, where, it was it growing anxiety about China? Was it realizing just how dependent we were on Taiwan? Was it, it was a little before the AI boom, but maybe seeing that coming or being like, oh, wow, our military, without smartphones, we're screwed. Like what actually, you think pushed policymakers over the edge on this one?
I think uh, the most important trend shaping that discussion was the trajectory of China under Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
The recognition that a kind of consensus kind of had emerged over decades that saw globalization as almost entirely benign actually had had exposed some real vulnerabilities from a standpoint of national security. And when you think about it, we've never been in a great power competition as a country in a circumstance where we don't have massive industrial firepower to kind of fall back on. And so this really puts us in a new place. And I think because of the intense concentration of the semiconductor industry in Taiwan, and because of this emerging understanding of just how critically important the semiconductor industry is to the entire global economy and to militaries and all that, there was a handful of people on the Hill that really started talking about it and understanding it, and that all grew into the CHIPS Act. Meanwhile, the first Trump administration was appreciating it too, right? So it was the first Trump administration that convinced TSMC to initially make its investment in Arizona. Shortly thereafter, you saw Intel, Samsung, then Micron, and others also make commitments to invest in the United States. And this all is happening in the context of the CHIPS Act first being authorized at the end of 2020 through the NDA, and then being funded in 2022. So really, you start to see an inflection point. And then when the CHIPS Act gets funded, and we come in to try to make it work, and from an implementation standpoint, that's when you really see it take off.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you're hitting on a important point here, which is that the sort of strategic shift to focusing on China as our, sort of pacing adversary really happened under Trump. And that may have laid the preconditions to some extent for the renewed policy focus and in turn the kind of CHIPS Act.
That's right. I think some would say probably late Obama was the first kind of awakening to the geopolitical shift. And then the Trump administration, I mean, putting Huawei on the entity list is like another part of the story it's on the other side of the promote protect equation. But it's all part of this growing recognition that the kind of geopolitical dynamics of the 21st century demand some attention to reindustrialization.
Yeah. So that takes us up to the CHIPS Act itself and the design of it. And you started talking about, visiting Taiwan and seeing that, it's not just about a production facility. It's about everything that enables you to have that production facility and, a workforce and whatnot. So, how is the CHIPS Act sort of designed as a piece of policy to, foster this broader industry, not just, build one-off facilities?
The CHIPS Act had a few different components. So it's $52 billion overall. About 50 of that was at the Commerce Department. And then with that 50 billion at the Commerce Department, 11 billion was focused on R&D, 39 billion was focused on manufacturing. And so right there from Congress is a recognition that we need to both be focused on the kind of immediate priorities of reindustrialization now, as well as focused on the technologies of the future and putting the industry on a strong competitive footing going forward. The piece that I managed was that 39 billion focused on manufacturing. And with that 39 billion, I think one of the reasons we were able to have the success we did was that Congress actually gave us a pretty meaningful amount of flexibility in terms of how we thought about allocating that. And in the first instance, that meant that we were able to take a big picture portfolio level view of what we were trying to achieve. Early on in the program, we put out what we called our vision for success. We thought it was really important to not just start throwing darts at the dartboard, but to really define what we were, trying to make happen, to hold ourselves accountable to a vision, and then go try to realize that vision. But the act itself gave us the flexibility to kind of do that strategic thinking and set that North Star that we were trying to move towards. And once we did that, then it was really just a question of building the team and building the program and ultimately striking the deals necessary to make it happen.
Yeah, and I want to get into that, but you raise an interesting point, which is that a lot of times when Congress wants to fund some new industry, there's a lot of pork. So one thing's gonna be here in New York, another in California, a third in Texas and North Carolina, and by the way, in Montana, because that vote was key or whatever. Whereas in this case, it was a little bit more like we're going to give a big bucket of cash to the Department of Commerce and let them come up with a coherent strategy. Now, I'm sure there's politics and you're getting pressure and whatever, but it wasn't subject to quite the same sort of log rolling or whatever that a lot of congressional appropriations are.
Yeah, and it's not just in the allocation of the funding that there was that flexibility, but in the process, right? I think one place that implementation can really get screwed up is when you have statutory process requirements that may be well intentioned, but fundamentally kind of make it hard to get the job done.
Right.
And I think that's not to say that there weren't some process requirements. For example, we had NEPA. NEPA applied. Initially, we got a carve out from NEPA. Eventually, we got a carve out on NEPA from significant share of not all of CHIPS projects. So there were some things we struggled with, but overwhelmingly, I think we were able to design the process ourselves. And what that meant was that we could develop a process that was kind of where we were very clear about what we were trying to achieve and how we were going to evaluate applications and create very meaningful structures and frameworks around that, but gave ourselves the flexibility to be nimble and commercial and strategic in our orientation. And that's not to say the baseline of operating government is extremely difficult, and there are all sorts of ways that our government makes it hard on itself to be successful, and that would kind of drive me crazy over the course of implementation. But the CHIPS Act itself, I think, gave us a fair amount of flexibility to get the job done. I mean, I used to say, obviously, there's a huge amount of focus on risks and downside when you're implementing a program like this. And I would always say to the team, the number one risk is that we don't get this done, right? The number one, this is an urgent moment. The country needs us to be successful. We just have to move. And I think we didn't do everything perfectly, but ultimately, I think we were able to do that, and we had sufficient flexibility in the statute to do
that. I want to get back to the kind of work you guys did, but I mean, just to note, it's interesting because on the flip side, so there's less congressional direction mandated about exactly how you do it. On the flip side, it means you better do a really good job. I mean, the pressure's on you. It's not a formulaic grant program. I mean, the DOT funds lots of infrastructure, but it's literally an equation. How many miles of road, how much population, just send the money out. I mean, it's not much more complicated than that, and it would be quite hard to mess up. Whereas you really could have messed up. So the pressure was on you and the team to really execute. And so how did you end up then getting recruited for this role from Treasury?
So I had met Secretary Raimondo. Gina Raimondo was the Commerce Secretary. I had met her previously during the transition. Been talking to her about a different role before I ended up at Treasury right when it looked like CHIPS was going to pass. Because for a while it didn't look like it was going to pass, and then suddenly it was like it was going to pass. And so yeah, I had kind of stayed on the radar of her and her team, and we had kind of stayed in touch. And so they reached out in maybe July. The CHIPS ended up passing in August, and that began a conversation. My initial reaction was to say to her, I don't come from a semiconductor background. I don't come from a technology background. And so initially I was a little skeptical, saying, are you sure you want me to do this,
Right.
given the technical subject matter? And her pretty strong perspective at the time was that she wanted to build a team around someone who really had experience operating in government and getting things done in government. Government is a very different context. And this was basically a $39 billion startup in government, where we had to, build a team, build a program, outline the vision, get the money out the door. And so, and then, she committed that we would work together to build out the team that we needed to be successful. And so that's ultimately what we did. We built an extraordinary group of people from the public sector, from investment backgrounds, semiconductor backgrounds, consulting backgrounds, CIA, DoD, workforce, risk, operations, hiring, and contracting, the whole thing, external affairs, communication, the whole thing. And we built a team with a culture that just was focused on the mission. And people worked extraordinarily hard because we really felt it was important. It was important to the
Yeah.
country.
I just want to say on that, I mean, from the outside, I was very pleased as the team came together to see that you had that depth of expertise. And frankly, a lot of people who had been in very high powered roles in the private sector, building complicated projects, doing project finance, the kinds of skills you want to see. Because, I mean, you tell me, but you were then negotiating against these very large, sophisticated multinational corporations. And like, it's good to have some firepower on your side in those conversations.
Yeah, it's hard for me, just from a personal standpoint, it's hard for me to imagine trying to negotiate those deals without. I mean, the chief investment officer is Todd Fisher, who had spent 25 years at KKR, and the investments team just had extraordinary commercial sophistication.
Yeah.
And it was
Yes.
indispensable. It's funny because we also received some criticism about the makeup of the team.
Yeah.
And it was a little ironic.
Other people on the left coming up.
Yeah, it was kind of ironic because at the end of the day, if you asked the industry or industry counterparts, they would probably say that it was the commercial people, the private sector people on our team who were the most difficult to deal with because they have that muscle around negotiation. And so, yeah, I think it was indispensable.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, those you want their peers negotiating who actually know all this kind of stuff works.
Yeah. Ultimately, our goal was to get as much in terms of strategic outcomes, economic national security benefits, semiconductor investment in the United States for as little taxpayer investment as possible. And so you just need strong, and by the way, not only do you need strong kind of negotiating acumen, but you need true financial sophistication, because what you're doing is, the way we did it was to say, like, we want to see your financial models. We want to understand the profitability of the project, the cash flows over time. And we want to, make sure that we're going to give you a subsidy that is sufficient to get you to your hurdle rates, to the rate of return you need to make this investment worthwhile, but not more than that.
Right.
Right. And that requires just a level of financial capabilities as well.
I just want to push on that a little bit more. I mean, because that's an interesting tension to some extent. Because on one hand, you're saying to these big multinationals, TS and the others, come to the U.S. We want you to come build your factories here. It's important to us that you do so, and we're willing to pay you. Essentially, I mean, we're willing to give you money, subsidize you. On the other hand, right? If I'm them, I just want to get as much free money as possible. Well, why wouldn't you? The government's offering you money, your business. So how did that kind of play? I mean, to some extent, you're trying to build a partnership. On the other hand, it's an arm's length transaction. You're trying to negotiate. What was that dynamic like in real time?
Yeah, I mean, so our biggest four awards were to TSMC, Intel, Samsung, and Micron. Those four companies, we had 39 billion total, and we didn't want to give all our money to those four companies. We wanted to, because we had a broader set of objectives as I laid out. But those four companies alone asked for more than 70 billion in incentives. So immediately we're in a position where it was going to be a set of very difficult discussions.
Right.
And I think the challenge we had was engaging in a set of tough negotiations that weren't always fun, while maintaining trust and maintaining the sense of kind of fairness in
Yeah.
process. And I don't think it was tough. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was tough. But I think that because we we said in advance what we were trying to do. So like I talked about that vision for success, when we were negotiating with companies, we'd go back to that and say, we've always said, this is our this is why we have to do this, because we have all these objectives. Because we had a rigorous analytical framework around scoping and sizing awards, because we were consistent in our approach throughout. I think we were largely successful in being able to straddle that dynamic, or kind of meet that challenge.
Yeah. A prepared mind went a long way in that process.
Yeah, I used to say, you can't fake rigor. And by the way, it's not only with the industry, but because it's everything. The industry they might be talking to each other, or things seep out to the press, or things get to the Hill. So like when I say you can't fake rigor, it's that like that discipline, doing the business of the country and the taxpayer kind of the right way, then creates a environment where the broad set of stakeholders fundamentally can have trust in what you're doing.
Right, because you're under intense public scrutiny also. I mean, Congress cares how the money is spent. Political opponents are looking to embarrass you. I mean, that's one of the challenges you face in government you don't face in other contexts, is that level of transparency. So what I hear you saying is having, putting forward the vision and then executing clearly against that vision with a sense of fairness and, prudence for the public fisc is what allowed you to kind of thread those needles and get the deals done while not, essentially while maintaining the political viability of the effort. So before we get to the kind of impact and going back to some of the big deals you mentioned with Samsung and Micron and the like, you said it's a startup in government, and that's a pretty rare opportunity, especially with that kind of resources. I mean, it's one thing to stand up some small office, but this is a big, high profile thing. You're starting from literally a standing start. What were some of the specific challenges or, biggest hurdles for you, or some of the work you're most proud of in that effort?
Typically in the private sector, you don't get $39 billion as a startup, right? There's kind of a reason for
Yeah.
that. It's like an inherent baked in challenge in terms of trying to get to that scale so quickly. And that's not a perfect parallel, but CHIPS Act passed in August of 22, and I joined in September, and I was the first employee. And so you're kind of, you're sitting there with this massive problem to try to solve, and an incredible amount of work to do, not only operationally, but big picture intellectually. Like, what are we trying to achieve? And you're just trying to also build it all from scratch. I mean, the early days, I didn't have a special assistant. So it was like my days were like, my evenings were done like scheduling meetings, because I didn't have
Right. You had to get your laptop. I mean, it's just
yeah,
literally not
no,
the space, everything.
exactly. Now that said, what Secretary Raimondo had done is actually task a small team within the Commerce Department, including Donner Dubinsky, who is very successful and seasoned technology executive from Silicon Valley, with preparing the department for implementation of the CHIPS Act for about 6 months before on the just in case it did, right? Like, we have to be ready. And then when it passed, she got all of her senior leadership of all the bureaus in the Commerce Department in the room and said, I need you to each give a couple of your top people the chips. I don't care what they do. I don't care what their expertise is. If they're good, I want it. So when I got there were maybe 10 people who were short-term detailed the chips. And most of them didn't end up on the team long-term, but it meant that I wasn't like totally starting from scratch and that we could kind of hit the ground running. Early on, really focused on hiring and just like building that talent. And Secretary Raimondo was personally very invested in that. She was personally helping.
She was picking up the phone and calling top
She
recruiters.
was picking up the phone. It would be like, hey, we need to close this, or and she'd pick up the phone and help make that happen. I would still say probably about half the people from the private sector we tried to recruit, like ultimately had to say no because of some conflict of interest or they didn't want to divest a holding or that kind of thing.
Huge pay cut, family. I mean, there's all
Yeah, pay cut. Yeah, there's all sorts of things, but contracting in the government is so hard, right? So like, it would have been, what I wanted to do is as soon as I got there, just go find a team of like highly talented consultants to say like, hey, can you help me for a couple of
right.
months? But even that takes forever to onboard, and getting in. We eventually we need an investment bank that took it forever to onboard, like all this stuff. So yeah, and then on top of it, you have to do the intellectual work to lay out the vision for success and design the program. Those early days, felt pretty desperate, but they were also incredibly fun. Like they were very heady. And then eventually over time, we just kind of built a machine. And most importantly is we really built a machine around recruiting and hiring. So the secretary had appointed JD Grome, who was like her within the secretary's office, the CHIPS lead, to really focus on recruiting and kind of building out that pipeline. And then internally within CHIPS, we kind of built an operation to hire my chief of staff, Sarah Myers, Todd's chief of staff, Sarah Rourke, to really build out an operation. And then it was kind of an extraordinary thing where we went from scraping and clawing for every new person to suddenly the bill passed in August, suddenly it may be in like February, March, it would be like, oh, this Monday, like 20 people joined, and it was like, okay, wow, we're really cooking with gas.
Yeah, it was a virtuous cycle, bring in
It,
talent, recruit more.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And people, then their friends bring in their friends. And, Todd and I went on Odd Lots, which is like another podcast. And then like 5 different people heard that and ended up joining the team. It's like these things kind of end up being so we got that momentum, which was hugely important because it's just, of all the things, it is impossible to do it without an extraordinary team.
Yeah. Yeah. And to some extent, I mean, my guess is in a couple of years, maybe now it's a real badge of pride to have worked at the CHIPS office. I mean, it's a sort of notable success for, federal service.
Yeah, I think we feel it's an amazing community. It is an amazing community. Yeah.
So now you've gotten the team, you've written your vision plan, you're executing, and you guys end up in a relatively short period of time by any measure, let alone in government work, getting some quite large deals done. So maybe talk us through one or two of these, the deals of the many you did, whether it's the Micron in New York or the folks in Arizona, and maybe a little bit about the impacts we're already seeing on the ground.
Yeah, why don't I start with impacts, and then big picture, and then I can kind of talk through some of those specifics. We are now we've seen uh, since chips passed, $500 billion in announced investment in the U.S. semiconductor industry. Um, and importantly, that's not just like press release announcements. So actual dollars in the ground, like economic data, you've seen more investment going into electronics manufacturing in the United States since chips was authorized than in the last 3 decades prior. So it is true. It is a true hockey stick.
It has
effect.
actually catalyzed private
It is actually catalyzed
in a meaningful way.
in a meaningful way. We have there are 5 companies in the world across logic and memory. There are 5 companies in the world that can produce leading edge chips. So it's Samsung, TSMC, Intel, Micron, and SK Hynix. And all 5 of them are now have significant projects to manufacture on our shores. There's no other economy in the world with more than 2 of those companies. So we have really emerged as a premier destination for semiconductor manufacturing. That's not to say that there aren't risks going forward, and there aren't different trajectories the industry can take from here. Like, it is still very much the early innings. It takes 3-4 years to build a fab, and then it operates for a couple decades, right? And to truly build out an ecosystem, you're talking about building out multiple on a single site, and then attracting suppliers and all that, as we talked about. So, but I think it's a really, really good start. The size of the individual investments are extraordinary. So TSMC are when CHIPS was passed, they had announced a $12 billion investment. Our deal with them got them to 65 billion. That's 65. That's 3 fabs. That 65 billion is the largest foreign direct investment in a new project in the history of the country. The second largest in the history of the country was Samsung's investment in Texas. So the scale,
largest foreign direct investments in history.
Yes. And now TSMC has committed to doing 165 billion. So they've added another 100 billion, fully build out their, what they call a gigafab. And it's not just at the leading edge. We have Global Foundries doing very significant investments in New York and also in Vermont. Texas Instruments has a very ambitious set of projects, and really important set of projects in Texas and Utah. The upstream supply chain. So like every semiconductor fab, modern semiconductor fab, let's say, relies on 12-inch wafers. These are kind of big CD record looking things. That's the kind of foundational material input into semiconductor manufacturing. Global Wafers is a Taiwanese company, one of a handful of companies in the world that produces those, has a massive project expanding out in Texas. So it's able to feed the wafers into that.
Which is exactly what you want to see, is that supply chain.
Right. And then upstream of the wafers is the polysilicon. And Hemlock announced a major project in Michigan. So they get polysilicon in Michigan, the wafers in Texas, and then those can go around the country to support the manufacturing. And then downstream of the manufacturing, I think one thing we're really proud of is the impact on the advanced packaging ecosystem, right? Because advanced packaging is important both for core supply chain resilience reasons. Like if you're continuing to send package things in China, you're not really getting the strategic benefits you want to see. But also from a technology standpoint, advanced packaging is really important going forward for the kind of energy efficiency and performance of leading edge chips.
What advanced packaging is.
Yeah. So basically, the semiconductor fab will manufacture the semiconductors onto wafers, and then you need a process for cutting those wafers into individual die and then integrating them into packaging, so that they can ultimately be incorporated into electronics. And that assembly test packaging is and advanced packaging is basically a kind of higher tech version of that, lower labor costs, et cetera. And so we really made it a strategic priority to onshore that, and there wasn't a lot of action on that when we started, and now I think we're seeing some really meaningful action. So a few miles away from TSMC, a company called Amcor announced a major project in Arizona. We had SK Hynix announced a packaging facility in Indiana. TSMC has now, as part of that $100 billion expansion, TSMC has now announced they're going to do 2 packaging facilities. Intel has a really important packaging facility in New Mexico. So I think that's another thing we feel like we made great progress on.
It's kind of, I worked in the Obama White House, and we were constantly talking about leverage. We're going to leverage private dollars, and like maybe we did sometimes, maybe we did, but in this case, it sounds like genuinely for every public dollar of subsidy, there was real impact, and over time, maybe the federal government, just in terms of taxes, ends up recouping its investment here.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we in terms of the CHIPS grant, it was more than 10 to 1 for total investment. Now, there's also a 25% investment tax credit, which is a really important part of the overall puzzle. But still, you're getting very significant return. We always conceived of the return to the taxpayer as being in economic and national security, right? Yeah. Being in the production of semiconductors that are crucial to our supply chains and to the technologies of the future.
And that takes me to the final topic I want to cover. I mean, it'd be great if we recoup our dollars, 1 for 1 or more. But fundamentally, and going back to the beginning of the conversation, this is about U.S. competitiveness and security. And so what have you seen in terms of China's reaction to all of this? And as you look at all the development that's happened, are there still concerns you have about other potential choke points or sort of liabilities in our, sort of semiconductor ecosystem and supply chain?
Well, number one, I think the scale and aggressiveness of PRC, of Chinese investment in the industry, cannot be overstated. There's a lot of attention on that at the leading edge. There have been export controls relating to the China's leading edge ecosystem, and questions of can Huawei, SMIC, all these companies produce leading edge chips. But also, I think in part as a result of export controls, you've seen huge investment go into trailing edge chips, legacy chips, and those are, as I said at the beginning, absolutely essential to our supply chains. The impact of that on the global marketplace is only beginning to really be felt, and I think it's something we have to take very seriously. I think the other thing I would say in response to that question is chips was a supply side incentive. I think we worked really hard to deploy that supply side tool as effectively as we possibly could. We tried, and I think we're successful in generating demand for US manufacturing by working directly with the major customers of these facilities. But ultimately that was relational, right? Like we didn't have strong policy tools or incentives
You
there.
can't make them buy the chips.
Right. And so I would say that both at the leading edge, but also really importantly at the, what are called foundational chips, essential legacy chips, whatever you want to call them, an important focus for policymakers going forward is thinking about how to thoughtfully incorporate demand side incentives. And that's hard because it's easy to screw up and kind of distort things in a way, but I think it is really important to focus on.
And that gets to my final question related, which is there were reasons that chip manufacturing moved overseas historically. It was cheaper to do it in Taiwan. Labor is cheaper. Maybe there's it was cheaper, to get things built. And, chips provided a kind of one-time subsidy to get these facilities built. And it sounds like has had a very positive impact. But ultimately, market forces are going to have a big say in the sustainability of this industry in the U.S. Obviously, if people are willing to buy made in America chips, that bakes in the demand. But absent that, do you have concerns about this kind of economic sustainability of this industry, or are there other steps you can think about?
I think it's a complicated question. Like I think on the one hand, I would say that the kind of globalizing forces of the last few decades in terms of raw market dynamics are not going to be the same going forward. I mean, this is now an industry that is so deeply shaped by geopolitics and customers, shareholders, they are asking a set of questions. They might not be asking those questions with the same urgency that we felt at the Commerce Department, but like there is, I think, commercially a greater interest in geographic diversification, which was a huge tailwind for chips, right? Is a
we
sense
don't
that
want to be dependent on China. That's a risk to our business. Putting aside costs is just not a good.
And in that context, I think because of chips, we have a really strong foundation in which to engage that, right? I mean, particularly at the leading edge. I mean, there are only so many places in the world that companies feel like they can credibly produce leading edge chips, right? You're not competing against every country in the world. You need some measure of a workforce and an ecosystem and other national strengths. So I think that the market forces, how they will shape things going forward, will be different. And I think it needs to be a continued focus for policymakers. I think both those things are true.
Yeah. Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining Political Capital, and thank you for your service. I mean, you really went in there and executed and helped address a big challenge facing our country. So, as a citizen and a taxpayer, I'm grateful for your work.
Thanks, Nate. I appreciate that. It's good to talk to you.
Take it easy.